Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar together. I should also say good afternoon because it may not be evening for everyone, even though it is for me here on the East Coast. But I want to welcome you to our webinar entitled Anabaptism and U.S. Gun Culture. I am your host. I'm Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz, the Denominational Minister for Peace and Justice for Mennonite Church USA. And tonight I am very happy to be joined by Andrew Suderman, who's the Associate Professor in Theology, Peace, and Mission at Eastern Mennonite University, and Melinda Berry, who is the Associate Professor of Theology and Ethics at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. I am looking forward to an engaging evening, as we've already spent a little bit of time together, and I felt like I attended the webinar before we even got started. So really looking forward to both of you joining us today. So tonight's gathering, just to let you know, is in webinar format. So all those who are attending are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat that you can access. Some of you have sent in questions. Thank you for that. We welcome your questions and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Please feel free to use the Q&A that you will see at the bottom of your screen, and only the panelists will be able to see those questions, and we will hopefully be able to get to them. If you need Spanish interpretation, please click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. I also want to note a couple of things as before we get started. One is that this past Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and I want to acknowledge this shooting on September 28 of Jacob Johns, who was an Indigenous climate activist, artist, musician, and father. It was during a peaceful prayer ceremony in Tula Territory in New Mexico. Jacob put his body between women and children when the shooter charged towards the altar and prevented the shooter from harming women and children. He was airlifted to a hospital in Albuquerque and has had a number of surgeries and continues his recovery. So we want to remember that community, that family. As we made the decision to talk about ending gun violence as part of our Learn, Pray, Join initiative, we talked about the complexity of the issue. And it reminded me of something I used to say in conflict transformation trainings when talking about conflict within our family and or our friend groups. It was the idea that because we love one another, we agree not to talk about hot button topics like religion, politics, and I would add guns. But the reality is that gun violence conversations cannot remain in the shadow. I think we must find ways to both lament while at the same time find ways for prophetic calls to peacemaking. So tonight, during this webinar, our panelists will explore the issues that drive today's violent gun culture in the U.S. and examine how our Anabaptist faith informs our response. I also recognize, given this topic, that there might be things that cause a response that perhaps you weren't expecting within yourself. And just to know that you should take time to take care of yourself how you need to, if that happens for you, please feel free to step away for a time if you need to. Just wanting to, again, to acknowledge that. We're not sure that that will happen, but there's that opportunity for responses such as that. Before we begin, please join me in a word of prayer for our time together. God, we come before you with heavy hearts, burdened by the epidemic of gun violence that plagues our communities, our world. Grant us the wisdom to seek peaceful solutions to the complexities of life that cause people to seek violence, either to themselves or to others. Provide us with strength to work together to protect the vulnerable and to ensure the safety of all. We ask for your guidance in the pursuit of laws and policies that provide that safety. May your love and compassion touch the hearts of those who choose violence. We pray for comfort for those who suffer from the consequences of gun violence. And we pray for courage to be agents of change within our communities, both locally and globally. Amen. So tonight, as we get started, we have questions for the panelists, and so I will I will start with one. They may take turns. One may respond to one and not another. We're gonna let the spirit move as it may with us today. So I'm going to start with the question: what are Anabaptist principles or teachings that contribute to, as well as challenge, the prevailing gun culture in the U.S.?
Andrew, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, so one way I want to respond to that question is by talking about like what gun culture is, or what we mean by gun culture. And maybe as I do that, I want to just point out that so most Mennonites in North America, and I guess we should also at some point determine, like when we're using the term Mennonite, Anabaptist, like what do we mean by these things? But there are, for a lot of Mennonites in North America, here I'm thinking specifically of the United States and Canada, and there's this very uneasy relationship, or there can be this very uneasy relationship with the concept of culture. Like culture can mean the world, but one of the things that people like Andrew and me, like, we want to help people get a little bit more comfortable with the concept of culture, because in the church we have a culture, right? So culture doesn't necessarily just mean the world. And so when we start talking about cultures, we're talking about the structured and unstructured ways that people figure out or identify themselves with different groups or different kinds of activities, different rituals. They're like culture is a complex thing. So when it comes to gun culture, this is a term that, at least by some historians' reckoning, was coined in 1968 by a historian named Richard Hofstadter. And he was, and he wrote an article and delivered some talks in the wake of the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, along like and there were riots that were happening along with this. And he was noticing some of the dynamics in U.S. American culture at that point related to guns. And one of the things that he points out is that in the United States, almost in a problematically unique way, we seem to think that owning guns and using guns is an inalienable right. And if you start to compare that aspect of American culture with other democracies, industrialized democracies, that's really out of step with where most of those societies are. And another piece of this is this sense that, and a belief that guns help us stay safe, which again is laughable, because Hofstadter says, or at least he, was arguing, some of these other industrialized democracies that have much, much tighter gun control laws are able to protect their citizens much more effectively than we are in the United States. So there's this kind of paradox going on in the logic of gun culture. Another piece of what Hofstadter said in his 1970 article, though, was that then started to create some problematic stereotypes, is that people who are most deeply entrenched in gun culture tend to be Southerners, U.S. Southerners, and they tend to be rural. So that has also then kind of contributed to a lot of polarization around guns. So more recently, some public health folks have, because public health has gotten interested in questions of guns and gun violence because so many people are being killed by guns, accident or injured. And what they discovered is that we actually almost need to talk about gun cultures, plural, or at least there are subcultures within gun culture that vary from state to state. So there are some people who own guns for recreational purposes. What that means is they go hunting with their guns. There are, or maybe they like to go to shooting ranges, right? Having guns is related to how they spend their leisure time. There are other people who own guns primarily as a form of self-defense. And then there are, like, a third category would be people who own guns as part of a protest around raising awareness and kind of activism related to the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Now, people might own guns for a variety, for crisscrossing these three categories I just delineated. But what studies are showing is that even within these three groups, there's more kind of separating out. So, and what's on the rise are people who are purchasing and owning guns for self-defense and as part of this kind of Second Amendment activism. So that when we're talking about gun culture in this webinar context, I suspect we're talking primarily about the self-defense piece as well as the Second Amendment activism. Now, I mean, I think it's also, we also have some questions related to hunting and Anabaptism, but I think when it comes to this, the part, like when I think of gun culture, and what starts to get my mind spinning and my heart pumping is the polarization that we experience around this notion that it's an inalienable right that people should be able to arm themselves and defend themselves. Now, I got involved in all of that. So Lorraine, can you tell me, have I answered the question?
Oh, I think you've certainly answered the question about the prevailing gun culture. I think that was really helpful. Yes, yes. And so, Andrew, maybe you want to pick it up and talk more about kind of the Anabaptist principles and teaching that contribute to, challenge that culture that Melinda talked about.
Yeah, and it's a very it's a good question. I have to begin, I think, by highlighting the fact that first that I'm a Canadian. And so I am a Canadian who has lived in several different parts of the world, including spending 10 years in Latin America. And 5 of those years were in Colombia. And so when I was a teen, I lived in Colombia, which was going through a civil war. And later on, my wife and I, when we got married, we then also spent 7 years in South Africa. Now, these two places, Colombia and South Africa, have unfortunately significantly violent histories, and they continue to wrestle with the violence within their setting. It was interesting, however, when we moved to the United States and I started to teach here in Virginia, the prevalence and the way in which people in the U.S. viewed and understood guns, as Melinda was talking about, as this inalienable right. And it was just striking in my classes and elsewhere to hear this just simply stated kind of fact or stated reality. And even among some of our Mennonite students and some within, and I've been hearing also within some of our Mennonite churches. And so that has been for me, has been one of the kind of significant culture shocks in moving to and now living in the United States, is dealing with how people, how we view and understand guns in general. I think within our Mennonite Anabaptist church, I think there's an assumption and there's a solid foundation that has been built and assumed that peace is at the heart of the gospel. And that peace is something that God ultimately wants and desires for the world. And so I think it's important for us to begin to wrestle with the question when we start talking about issues such as guns and so on and so forth. Start wrestling with the question about whether or how does this allow us or invite us toward living a life dedicated to Jesus's ways of peace in this world. And I think more and more, I mean, I, for one, have trouble finding or have trouble seeing kind of the restorative nature of guns themselves. I think that guns, by the way that how the guns are created as a mechanism to harm and cause death, ultimately. And it's difficult for me to see and to recognize how that fits into God's desire for restoration and for peace within this world. And so I think Mennonites have a long history of understanding ourselves as a peace church. I've been flipping that around a little bit and not talking about being a peace church per se, but rather being a church that's dedicated to the ways of peace. And so that causes us, I hope it causes us to question and to think about what then leads to peace and what doesn't lead to peace. And so using that type of a lens, I hope helps us to analyze a little bit more about questions such as guns, questions such as culture, as Melinda helpfully pointed out. What kind of a culture do we want to create? What kind of a culture do we want to embody as a people that's dedicated to Christ's way of peace? And ultimately, I think the other question is, what kind of peace are we talking about? Because I think that there have been and there are multiple understandings of peace that also need to be complexified. Complexified, is that a word? Made more complex. We need to wrestle with that.
Well, I want to just tag on to what Andrew was just saying, if I may. And in the realm of peace theology, this, like Andrew's using the word peace, right? Which of course, and obviously we use, but kind of what's underneath that is this principle of biblical shalom. Now, shalom shows up in the biblical text in a variety of ways, but when we talk about this as like a biblical theme or as a theological concept, we see that shalom, or which gets translated into English as the word peace, has these multiple meanings, right? That it has to do with physical well-being and material well-being. It has to do with the relationships between people and between nations. So like at kind of the interpersonal level and at the international level. And then shalom, and so we might think of this as justice, right? Wellness, justice. And then this third dimension is about integrity. Like, are we people of shalom? But then Perry Yoder, who was one of my teachers, he talks about how shalom is also the Bible's word, not just for peace and justice, but for salvation. So that in Jesus, God is making shalom with us, right? And providing a pathway to salvation and healing. So that when Andrew is talking about when Andrew is talking about Jesus and peace and the church and its mission, like, he isn't just talking about social justice activism, right? He's talking about these deeply embedded theological ideas and norms that propel us into the kinds of lives that seek to turn away from violence, right? And so I guess I just want to like amplify what Andrew is saying and make it clear too that that we aren't simply talking about a social program of activism that has Mennonites out in the streets advocating for gun laws. Like, I'm not saying that that's not important a thing to do, and we'll get to that later on in the conversation. But where we're wanting to ground the conversation, or how we're wanting to frame the conversation, is that this isn't just about ethics, that is like figuring out what the right and wrong things are to do, but it's about like how we are being formed as Christians. Like how are our beliefs translating into action, and also feeding a spirituality that helps us grow and mature as Christian people, right?
And I would also, that's exactly right. And I would also add wholeness. This idea that peace, this shalom that Perry Yoder talks about, is also referring to this idea of wholeness, of being complete with oneself, right? This peace with oneself, with others, with creation, with God. All of these aspects help to create wholeness within us. And when those things when there isn't peace within that, then we are not going to encounter peace. And this is very different from what emerged later on, for example, with the kind of the Latin notion of pax, right? Like if we think of pax romana and so on and so forth, it still gets translated as peace, but it's a fundamentally different form and understanding, an embodiment of peace, right? The pax romana is this idea, or this pax is this idea of an enforced peace, a peace that, so all of a sudden we start talking about, or we start kind of referring to, or seeing reference to peace as security, as peace as kind of a social order that we need to enforce and maintain, right? We start seeing the uses of quote unquote the peace, as in peace as a location or as a place, as opposed to understanding peace as shalom, as an activity, as a verb, right? And so that's why I say these different understandings of peace is fundamental to talk in, is fundamental in our discussion about what role, if any, do guns play in bringing about peace. Which peace are we talking about, first of all? Because that is going to shape the way in which we're going to wrestle and respond.
Yeah, if we think about shalom in terms of right relationships, how do we get to those right relationships? Are we able to do that with a gun in our hand? That seems a little takes us away from the shalom that I think I hear you talking about. So yeah, could be part of the conversation. I think I'm going to maybe jump around a little bit with our questions, but would be interested, especially as we're talking about relationships and peace, and what does that look like? You know, I hear people sometimes will say, well, I know what I believe, but we can't count on what others. And so when we have sin, when we have people who are using violence as a means to get to an end, so it's the question of, what does our Anabaptist faith teach us about self-defense, about protection of others or innocence, or even ourselves? How would you respond to that?
Well, so one place that I like to start is this song that is, I think is it a Felix Manz text? It comes from the 16th century, English translation. We are people of God's peace. And one of the lines in that hymn, Christ the Lord is our defense. Christ will never leave us. Like, so there is a spirituality. If you know, I mean, okay, look, we always love going back to the 16th century, right? So there is a spirituality that comes from, or that is part of this tradition, and this is related to this concept of biblical non-resistance. that we can get into a conversation about. And that is a huge part of 20th century Mennonite peace theology and biblical hermeneutic, like the way we interpret the Bible, that says we should not rely on armaments for our security. We rely on God. And that in the stories of the Old Testament, there seems to be a fairly clear prohibition. Adonai says, hey, if you start building up your own weapons stores, then you're gonna then you are not relying on me to defend you. And that is idolatry, putting our faith in weapons rather than God. So the Anabaptist tradition really takes this literally, that we are to be defenseless Christians. Now, there also has never been a kind of clear consensus on this, right? Like the Anabaptist tradition is a diverse one. And one of the things I think many of us don't quite realize is just how many different varieties of peace theology there have been. Most of us end up being kind of introduced or shaped and formed by one or two, or maybe a combination of some of these streams. And they were outlined in a pamphlet that Mennonite Central Committee put together in the late 80s called Mennonite Peace Theology, a Panorama of Types. And there were differences precisely around some of these questions related to the use of force, because some would say if Andrew hits me, I'm not supposed to hit back. Non-resistance. And then others would say, well, if Andrew hits me, of course I'm going to hit back, right? Why would you not defend yourself? That they don't read they don't adhere to a kind of a biblical ethic that is that literalistic as non-resistance. But what I would say in my experience is that there's something about biblical non-resistance that's been transmitted generationally. So even if people didn't hear those words, those values are deeply embedded, and they show up around our ambivalence around power. Because again, the defenseless, non-resistant Christian does not seek to use any forms of power. And here we're going to the Philippians 2 hymn where Jesus empties himself, right? And becomes obedient. And so there's also this kind of hermeneutic of obedience to Jesus, who is obedient to his Father. That seems to be kind of the template for how we interact with these issues. And I think it's been very difficult for us to figure out how to have conversations within our communities about what appropriate non-lethal self-defense looks like. Surely there is something between being completely passive and using a gun to kill someone who looks at me funny, right? One of the expressions that I'm familiar with is so I live in Elkhart County. There were a couple of Mennonites here who were trained in Taekwondo, and opened a dojo. I'm showing my ignorance here. What they had they taught, it was called Peacemakers Academy, helping people work at emotional self-regulation, using and how to use their bodies to defend themselves against an attack in a way that is not aimed at harming their opponent, right? So like, oh, I didn't even know that was an option, right? So I think our imagination is small in this area, and like we could use a little bit of sort of creativity and elasticity, and probably some encouragement to not be confined by our fear that if we that we're going to find and cross a boundary that we don't want to cross, and somehow find ourselves outside of the peace tradition. Like I suspect that that's part of the reason why we don't host conversations around self-defense very often. What do you think, Andrew?
The one other text that I would add to the ones that you mentioned, that we often turn to, would be Matthew 5 as well, and specifically Matthew 5 verses 38 to 48. This, go the second mile, turn the other cheek, love your enemy, etc. Right? Oftentimes, the way that it has been read and interpreted has been very one of my profs, Jim Reimer, he would talk about reading literalistically. And so it'd be reading it literalistically of, well, we just simply need to follow this and do this. What we haven't done, unfortunately, or maybe not as much, I think we are doing this more, but maybe we haven't done it as much historically, is understand the socio-political context in which Jesus was talking and offering these suggestions, and the ways in which each one of those suggestions was a non-violent way of precisely flipping the power differentials and the power dynamics on their head, right? Walter Wink has a brilliant, and he has a long history, a brilliant way of describing some of those, and I would encourage people to explore Wink's work around this. But ultimately, what I think is important is to highlight the ways in which these texts were not attempts at simply accepting the way things are and one's lot in life, and saying, well, okay, so I'm in a relationship where I'm being hit. No, that is not what that text is about. And, somehow justifying or somehow giving courage to the person who is being abused. No, that's not what that text is about. When we look at that in light of what Jesus was talking about in its socio-political context, we recognize how he's offering an alternative way and an example, and there might have been many more examples of nonviolent ways in which the power differential is flipped on its head, and the person who is experiencing the violence becomes an agent within oneself in how to embody God's way in this world, becomes an active agent. And so I think that is, significant as well in answering and kind of exploring this question, especially around, what kind of power do we embody? And again, here we have to, I think, analyze there are different forms and understandings of power. And I think, I find kind of analyzing the biblical text and the ways in which power is described and depicted within the biblical story very fascinating, because oftentimes within the biblical story, when people assume power over others, kind of this top-down form of power, most of the biblical authors are very quick to say that is not godly forms of power, and use very harsh language even to describe that, right? But when we understand power is of God, for example, and we are seeking to participate in God's form and understanding of power, which is fundamentally different, then there's a different depiction as to how there's a different depiction of the people who are trying to embrace and participate in God's power, recognizing, and I think, Melinda, this goes back to your point before, recognizing that God is our defense, that God is our, the one that we can rely on, the one that ultimately brings safety and security.
The other thing I maybe want to chip in here is that there is also a Christian tradition around, or like one of the signs that one has become a mature Christian is that that there is a relationship with death and with one's death, so that when death finds us, we are prepared to greet it as a friend. And that, I mean, so this also gets kind of complicated and easily distorted. But I think that, I guess what I want to, the reason I'm raising that is because this idea of being willing to lay down one's life for one's friends, is it, like, I think it's very evocative, and one of the, well, you know, like oftentimes Christian pacifists are met with this question: okay, so somebody breaks into your house with a gun and is going to rape your loved ones and dismember the people who you care about. What are you going to, aren't you going to stop them? Well, so there are all kinds of assumptions being made in that little scenario around, yeah, who has power and what control looks like. And it's, you know, it's a little, it's a question that's designed to say, well, of course I'm going to fight back, of course I'm going to do this, of course I'm going to do that. And what I don't like about the question is that it doesn't actually invite us to reflect on our convictions and talk about the ways that we make small choices, ordinary choices, that prepare us to respond in extraordinary circumstances in ways that are actually aligned with our values and our beliefs, right? It assumes that when one is in a catastrophic situation, then, oh, you aren't going to hold to your pacifism. Gotcha, right? So that I have found it a lot more productive to talk about myself less as a pacifist and more as a Christian who is oriented and reorients herself to a commitment to nonviolence. And that includes seeking to live my life in a way that I am prepared to meet death, if that is, you know, and meet death as a friend. Like that's a discipline.
Yep.
That's a discipline. So I guess I want to, that's my attempt to answer that question, and maybe it'll get some more questions for us.
I think I had a prof who talked about the way in which we prepare, ourselves will determine how we will act when and if those situations happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I remember, I mean, this was a constant question that we had to wrestle with, that my wife and I had to wrestle with, about when we lived in South Africa. What would we do if you know, somebody would break into our house? And in the South African context, violent break-ins is a regular occurrence. And so we had to wrestle with, how do we prepare ourselves for that? And it's one of those kind of situations where in owning a gun, it already begins to prepare us to use it, right? And so when something like that happens, I mean, we had friends that lived in Durban who, you know, there was somebody who was trying to actively break in, and he also was taught by that same prof up at CMU, who talked about this preparation. And he said, I mean, if I had something like that, yes, there's a good chance that I would have picked it up. That's why we don't have it. That's why we prepared ourselves not to have that in the house, so that isn't something that that isn't a tool within my you know, at my disposal, in how to deal with this particular situation, you know. And he found other ways of dealing with that particular situation, and believe it or not, it was a nonviolent way, and the situation actually resolved itself remarkably well, when it could have very easily been a different outcome, right? So the way we prepare ourselves will also affect the way in which we're going to act if and when those situations happen.
I so appreciate the conversation around that question, the robust conversation. I think as you were talking earlier, I thought, let's have a follow-up webinar just to talk about when you talked about historic non-resistance and how the abuse of power and how that's been used to oppress in many ways and used to harm those most vulnerable, some of the scenarios that you talked about. So I appreciate that part of the conversation and feel like we could have a whole webinar just on that. But thank you for mentioning those. I think that's really helpful. Let's talk about how, as one question came in, how the church can navigate the tension between advocating for nonviolence and supporting the right to bear arms. You talked about this a little bit earlier on, Melinda, that kind of inalienable right. How would you respond to this question specifically?
Well, okay, so my dad is a retired political scientist, and one of the things that he taught us, he said, politics are everywhere, and perhaps they're most insidious in the church because that's the place where we think we don't have them. So I'm kind of introducing that idea in response to this question, partly because well, I guess what I want to say is just because I am a citizen of the United States doesn't mean I have to agree with absolutely everything that's in the Constitution. Right? Like that's, I mean, that's part of the interesting dynamic of living in a nation that views religious freedom as really important. That and being in a kind of in a Republican democracy where I have the right to dissent. So while I understand that the Constitution says, hey, people have the right to bear arms, and that then there is a temptation in the church for us to say, well, it's our job to to respect all of these laws and amendments and rights and so on and so forth because we live here and that it guarantees us our own freedom. Like I actually think that well, what I guess, man, I have so many things I want to say. I don't think it's my job as a Christian, as a Mennonite Christian, to sort of actively defend rights guaranteed in the Constitution. Man, so I'm saying that, and I'm we'll test it out here. Maybe Andrew will come up with a way to push back, and then I'll have to sort of maneuver quickly. But I guess maybe another way I want to approach it is to say that there is like the context in which the Second Amendment is showing up has also to do with this nation's or kind of points of origin in England, where hunting was a big part of the culture there, and it was the culture of the landed gentry, and ordinary people didn't get to participate in that in those activities. So that that when you've got a bunch of lower class folks who were from England making up some of the citizenry here, and they're also needing to sort of defend themselves from the indigenous people here or other groups of settlers, being able to have weapons and go hunting and doing some of these kinds of activities actually helped prepare militia. So this idea that a yeoman, you know, kind of an ordinary dude, has the right to own a gun, and he doesn't need to get permission from a feudal lord to arm himself, is one of the kind of interesting twists on old world European social norms that the United States develops, or colonial America develops. And then it becomes kind of enshrined, and then it starts to take on a life of its own. And so in fact, what I would say is that part of my responsibility as a Mennonite Christian is to challenge some of the mythology around U.S. national and political norms. And to say, okay, 200 years later, is being able to buy a gun at your local superstore really, is this the same spirit in which the colonial government is trying to figure out how it can have a rough and ready set of soldiers to do its bidding? This is, to me this, like, we're starting to talk about apples and oranges. And so I guess I think of myself as wanting to engage in politics in this way that is critical of both sort of my internal, like some of the dynamics in my community, but also being able to turn some of that analysis, to do a kind of social scan of the world around me. So that's kind of how I would answer that question.
No, I appreciate that. It reminds me of that. It's that saying, just because it's the law doesn't make it right, but how we just assume that, of course, if it's the law, it's also right. And again, by whose standards and by where does that come from? Where did that law come from? I think it's a great way to frame that. Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say is, I mean, I'm not particularly, I mean, maybe I can cop out and say that it's because I'm Canadian, but I'm not particularly interested in needing to navigate between kind of the tension between the church and this idea that we can and or must bear arms, or that we can that there's this constitutional right. And so I was going to say precisely the same thing, that just because something is law doesn't mean that is what should guide our actions as disciples of Jesus Christ, right? I've lived in places where there have been laws that I think are questionable. We can look at South Africa again. South Africa, apartheid itself, this system, this social engineering project of racial segregation was law, right? It was part of the Constitution. So just because something is within the Constitution does not, I don't think, make it something that guides disciples of Christ in today's context, let alone what Melinda was talking about as well, right? Understanding the context, the political context, the social context in which it was written, let alone understanding what kind of gun are we talking about in the 17th or in the 16th and 17th centuries as opposed to today, right? I mean, technology, things have shifted, things have changed. I'm not sure that we're talking about the same things.
No, that's helpful. Yes, thank you. Let's here's a question that came up. Is it wrong to own a gun? Well, and I appreciated how you talked about that before we started the webinar, kind of that debate of not getting into, is it wrong? Is it not wrong? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I teach both theology courses and ethics courses. And often when I teach ethics, I tell students, okay, the first thing you need to know about me is that I don't like ethics. Oh, wait, what does that mean? So why are you teaching it? Well, what I mean is, so ethics is kind of first and foremost a branch of philosophy. And sometimes when we get into some of these philosophical conversations, we can start splitting hairs And we can start sort of feeling like, okay, I need to argue my point from a very sort of narrow methodological, like or sort of framework or approach, um and and somebody who is arguing with me from a different framework, like, well, we can't agree. And ethics can get like that. People start engaging in these litmus tests. Well, if you're a utilitarian and I believe in virtue theory, I'm not going to talk to you. Or if you're all about duty ethics and I'm about an ethic of care, we can't meet anywhere in the middle. And instead, I think what is more true to human experience is that in different situations, we employ different dimensions of these dominant forms of ethics. Um, and and when we realize that in different situations we use different tools of ethical reasoning or different frameworks, that can also free us to realize that morality, which is what ethics is interested in. Ethics is the study of morals. How do we determine what it means to be a good person? What kinds of outcomes for our actions do produce good outcomes for people? That morality is more than just a checklist of right and wrong things to do, right and wrong behaviors, right and wrong actions. Now, that can be really challenging when maybe some of us were taught it's always wrong to lie, and for someone to say, well, it might not be wrong to lie. Oh, so it's always wrong to own a gun. There is something deeply embedded in me, Lorraine, as a Mennonite, that wants to answer your question. Yeah, like, no, it's not okay for Mennonites to own guns. I know that there are Mennonites who own guns, right? So as soon as I kind of make that declarative statement, now I've got to figure out, well, how do I turn to my neighbors in my faith community, um, and say that they're a good person if I'm saying that only bad people own guns, right? So this goes back to this idea of shalom as integrity, is where I want to go. If we how do we approach the question of gun ownership in terms of wholeness and wellness, integrity and justice, right? That would be sort of my invitation to people who want to wrestle with this question, or who would prefer it just being kind of clear cut and dry. There is a consensus: Mennonites don't own guns. Is that, yeah, because it's not realistic. I mean, I'm about to tell a story on myself. I grew up in a family where there were prohibitions against guns. I mean, and I don't think we ever really even talked about it. My father grew up in a home where my grandparents would routinely threaten each other with the shotgun, and he wasn't interested in that dynamic in his own home. My mother grew up a traditional Swiss Mennonite. And in like her father was one of the last in the long birth line and wasn't living on the farm, and so there weren't guns. And so of course there aren't guns in our home. Well, so I'm married to somebody who grew up in a Mennonite farm family in Maryland, and they had guns because there are pests around the farm. Or like maybe if a horse gets injured and you need to put it down, like, so you have guns, you keep them locked in gun cabinets, and there are all kinds of protocols. But then we purchased a rental property, or purchased a property at a sheriff's auction in our neighborhood to keep a slumlord from buying it. And it was still full of family possessions that included some guns. And my husband is like, okay, there's some guns in this house. What like, let's have a conversation about what we're going to do about these guns. I was like, we're getting rid of them, right? Like that's just what we're doing. Well, my husband was somebody who was taught how to appropriately use a gun. And he is interested in orienting our children in that same way. Let me tell you, this pushes all my buttons. But I guess I'm telling the story on myself to illustrate my point that like even if I adhere to an ethic that says no way, no how should Mennonites own guns, my family owns guns. I haven't ever seen them. I don't know where they are, but we are in possession of guns. So this is part of the reason why I'm encouraging us to try to orient ourselves away from what's right and what's wrong, and toward, are we people who have the ability and capacity to have a conversation about our values, our commitments, our concerns, and then together choose a course of action. Discernment.
A communal discernment, which is I would say kind of a key element of Anabaptism. I think the way that I would respond to the question is by recognizing, or by first exploring what or how guns affect us, and not just in terms of how they affect people, how they affect people who are shot or whatnot, but rather how do guns affect the way in which we imagine, the way in which we see the world, right? There's a Canadian philosopher by the name of George Grant that I've been doing some work on, who's got he's done some brilliant work around looking at technology. And one of the arguments that he makes is that technology is not neutral. Now, oftentimes when in my classes, right, when I'm teaching Christian ethics or whatnot, and I don't start off with I hate ethics, but anyway, when we begin the class, I sometimes kind of put an image of a gun, on the screen and say, is this good or bad, and have the students kind of have a debate, right? And then we move on and look at different kind of objects or instruments, and have this debate as to whether something is good or bad. And it's fascinating how 9 times out of 10 most students respond by, well, I mean, a gun is a gun. It's a neutral thing. It's a piece of technology. It's the way in which you use it, or it's the person who uses it. And so often often I've heard, I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating, I've heard these phrases, right? Like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And so let's stop talking about kind of guns itself, and let's start talking about people and so on and so forth, even though ironically we're not interested in either in kind of making policies or whatnot that also limit that portion of it either, which is right. But George Grant talks about how technology itself is not neutral. It affects the way in which we think. It affects the way in which we see the world, right? We no longer see the world the same way because of whatever technology, whatever quote unquote instrument that we might have, how that shapes our world. The invention of the spork, I don't know if you know of the spork, this camping utensil that includes both a fork and a spoon, right? What would not have been possible if we also did not first invent the fork and the spoon. And so technology kind of builds on each other, and it shapes the world in which we live, and it shapes our thinking in the way, and it shapes our thinking and our imagination. And so I think, in my opinion, one of the things that we have not done, which we need to do, is start talking about the ways in which guns shape our imagination and begin to shape the way in which we think, right? I think it was Abraham Maslow, who once talked about, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail, right? When all we have are guns, or when we rely so heavily on a gun, then that's going to be the solution toward everything else. That's going to be the solution towards, social ills and social problems that we may encounter, rather than actually exploring what are creative ways in which we can tackle these difficult situations. And so I think that's where I would begin, rather than asking, is it right or wrong to own a gun? Let's talk about how guns have affected our society. And I think one of the other things that I just find, I mean, I have found deeply troubling in moving to the U.S. and kind of building on this, and the way in which it has affected society within the U.S. is how oftentimes, and there's an irony here, oftentimes we talk about, or people talk about, guns are necessary in order to safeguard our freedom. And yet, many freedoms begin to get curtailed because of guns, right? And so, when you go to a sporting event, all of a sudden, at least here, if you go to a sporting event, they might say, okay, you need to wear your clear backpack. So all of a sudden, we have to, we are no longer free to wear whatever backpack we want because of the fear that guns have created within society. And so we have to wear clear backpacks. We start creating and investing in architecture and other items that can withstand gunshots and so on and so forth, right? Within our schools and so on and so forth, all of a sudden we're coming up with all these different inventions as to how to deal with people with guns. We begin to experience more and more what I would describe as checkpoint routines, right? The police are increasingly and more afraid because everybody has a gun. The police are more and more afraid, and that leads to more and more police shootings. And we already have a significant problem around that. So these things these things shape our society and shape the imagination precisely because of what guns are doing to the way in which we think. And I think that's a conversation that would be important to have.
Well, the only thing I want to chip in there to Andrew's very important points is that the Pew Research Center they routinely study attitudes towards guns, and they published the results of a study just here in July of 2023. Camille has I think a link to some of that data she can put in the chat. And one of the key findings, they identify 11 important takeaways, and one of those is that people in the United States are split 49-51, precisely around this question: does kind of more access to guns make us safer, or does it make things more dangerous? And the fact that there is a kind of a deadlock there, I don't know. For me, that's illustrative of the point you were making, Andrew, that guns shape the way we think, right? And so if I am part of gun culture and I can't imagine feeling safe without a gun, compared to like my actual formation, which is no guns, and I can't imagine feeling safe with a gun, then what does it look like to try to bring shalom into some of those kinds of social relationships, right, where there are those social divides? It's to me that I mean, this is some stuff that we gotta start praying for miracles, because I don't see a clear path through the polarization without conversion. That is, people having a very intense, life-changing experience that challenges some of their fundamental beliefs around the safety that having a gun provides.
And even not even and yes, praying for miracles, but I would also say highlighting some of the ironies that exist. You know, like this is going to guns provide freedom, or guns are, that they provide the basis for freedom. And yet I had a student who, she was saying how she can't wait until she turns 21 so she can get her concealed weapons permit. And so we had an interesting conversation, like, well, why would that be necessary? Well, for protection and for, self-defense and that sort of thing. And a previous class, she talked about precisely how we live in a free country. Like, but you're not but the fear that you have doesn't seem to be of a free country, right? Like there's an irony there that isn't quite matching up. And I think we have to start paying attention, or maybe we're not, we don't have to start, maybe we are, but we just need to kind of continue to highlight some of those ironies that I think exists.
I think that's really, very helpful way to respond to that question. I think it also, in many ways, answers the question that someone else had asked about, how do we talk about the problem of gun violence without getting into these basically heated debates? We know, as I said, we don't talk about this at our family Thanksgiving because we all want to enjoy the turkey and because we all love each other. But on the other hand, I think to frame it, if we could frame questions around some of the things you each talked about in terms of, the communal discernment, if we could talk about wholeness, if we could talk about wellness and integrity and justice, I think it takes some of the heat out of the conversation because we would likely find that we'd have more things in common than we do apart. So, I think that's a way that we have some of those conversations is framing it in the way that you have both so eloquently talked about. So I really appreciate you doing that. I also am just taking notice of the time. And so I think I want to ask one more question, and it kind of brings two of them together before we end. And this one is about advocating for peace through government or political engagement. Is it consistent with our Anabaptist beliefs? Should we be advocating, and changing gun control laws? What would you say to that? Melinda, you're muted.
Still mute. There we go. So this takes us into another kind of well-worn, complicated path within the Mennonite peace theological tradition. Because as you know, in the panorama of types that I referenced earlier, different people view advocacy with the government, the state, being like is it around trying to be effective? Is it around trying to be faithful? Should we even bother? There isn't a clear consensus around that. And certainly Mennonite Central Committee, which has a long standing history of doing this both in Ottawa and Washington, D.C., and then also at the United Nations in New York City, finds that they get to go do advocacy with lawmakers who are sent there by votes from Mennonite communities, and these are members of Congress who aren't interested in voting with MCC, right? Or like we've never been able to get the Peace Tax Fund to go anywhere, right? So we kind of encourage ourselves by saying, well, it's not about being effective, it's about being faithful, it's about showing up and building relationships and preaching what we practice. And that takes a lot of stamina because most of us want to be, it's a need to be effective, a shared human need to be effective in the contributions we're trying to make toward building a better world or welcoming the reign of God. So I'll admit to, in my own life, going from being really excited about advocacy work to I don't call my senators, I don't call my members of Congress, especially not in the world of like faxes and emails. And yeah, I would say I've become sort of disillusioned with a lot of that kind of work. But when I understand, like if I reframe it as for some people, it's a strategy to meet a need, to be in the conversation, to keep issues of important moral concern in front of us, then I can support the work that people are doing. I I think that the challenges around partisan politics in the United States right now also makes this a complicated question to answer. And what I actually think is more effective advocacy when it comes to some of these issues is less about like knocking on legislators' doors and perhaps doing things like the Mennonite Church in Columbus did, sort of making their church a sanctuary, like doing things that that demonstrate our alternative social vision of the ministerial vision of Jesus at a local way that catches people's attention and starts to tell a different story. I think that has the potential. So I'm thinking here of Esther Augsburger's sculpture, where she and her son, got all these guns and they turned it into a plowshare, right? Those kinds of things, creating visual arts, offering monuments to a different way of engaging the conversation, I think is a form of advocacy that actually can withstand the test of time and isn't so ephemeral as knocking on doors and sending emails.
And that's on our campus. And it is a beautiful piece of work. I think I mean I would say, and I would argue that yes, I think we need to work at that advocacy piece. We need to continue to examine and provide solutions for some of these realities that plague us, that we're all that affect us all, and especially how they affect our social imagination. I think in that sense, though, we have to also recognize that may only go so far. It may only go so far. In other words, as I was saying before, the laws are not going to dictate, or laws do not kind of dictate what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean that we do not invite the principalities and powers. That doesn't mean that we don't invite the state, the government, people from all around to follow Jesus's ways of peace. I think that the invitation continues to be out there, but I don't think that we need to wait in order to embody and demonstrate something different in today's world until that happens, or until we are able to make this legislation or change this law. We can already enact that already as a community within our world. Desmond Tutu in the struggle against apartheid was brilliant at this. He would challenge the police forces. He would challenge the military. He would challenge the people of the apartheid state and say, look, come over here. That God is on our side. That God is against this injustice. Come to the winning side, please. And he would always have this invitation, right? And if you've ever seen Desmond Tutu, like, he has these brilliant blue eyes, and he would just that would just pierce through you, right? So he would just be, and so he would just have this constant invitation, but he never waited, right? He never kind of assumed that justice would only happen once, once the government accepted the accepted what people were struggling for, right? They could already begin to enact and embody the politic, the way in which they wanted to relate to each other, which is kind of at the root of what politics means, right? That they could already enact that form of politics already in the face of the apartheid government, and in that way provides provides a living example, a visible example of what it is that we're talking about. And I think that one of the core things within Anabaptism is precisely this idea of the visibility of the church, right? Of the visibility of the community of Jesus followers enacting and embodying now what the ethic, the way, the way of peace, the way that Jesus taught us in this world, right? I think of, for example, the Colombian Mennonite Church. There was one instance, it was an incredibly tragic incident where the person who helped to clean the church, the one of the churches in Tosaquillo, she was hit by the presidential motorcade as they were speeding through the roads. One of the presidential motorcade vehicles hit her and killed her. And it was an incredibly tragic event. At her funeral, I mean, the entire church and beyond came for her funeral, and the president felt so bad about what was felt so bad about the fact that his presidential car hit and killed this woman. He called and asked whether it would be possible for him to attend, him and his wife to attend the funeral. And so the pastor said, yes, by all means, you can come, pay your respects, come to the funeral. So the president of Colombia came to the church in order to attend that funeral. As they were entering, the president is surrounded by his bodyguards, and as they were entering, the pastor's wife, welcomed them at the door, but then stopped the bodyguard and said, those things, and there she was pointing at the guns that they had, those things don't come in here. And the bodyguards are like, wow, I mean, but this is the president. I mean, we have to be here. We have to protect the president, blah, blah, blah. Like, no, those things don't come in here. You are more than welcome to come in, but those things do not come in. All of a sudden, they had to question, like, what do we do? How do we? And so they kind of had a little meeting, and eventually they concluded that there would be some of the bodyguards that would stay outside, and they would have all the weapons outside, and a few of the bodyguards would follow the president inside, but that they would in fact actually, they would not in fact actually bring weapons into the church. And so I don't think that we have to wait for laws in order to be I think that we want to, because I think that it ultimately we think that it will help society at large, liberate us from this logic of fear and from the social imagination that guns create, which I talked about before. But we can already enact some of these things, and we can already embody them as visible examples within the United States and within our communities.
One other thing that occurs to me, Lorraine, here is going back to this earlier question: is it ever okay for a Mennonite to own a gun, or is it okay for Mennonites to own guns? Well, it occurs. So okay, if it's not obvious, Andrew and I don't own guns personally. Like, this is not our jam. But wouldn't it be interesting if there are people who in our church who are hunters, for example, to also see there might be some advocacy opportunities for them with some of their friends and hunting buddies to talk about gun culture in the United States, and what might it look like for them to talk about the ethics that they use, the practices that they have, the norms that they create around responsible gun ownership. Because I think without their and what might it look like for some of our congregations where we know that it's a, you know, it's a mixed polity, to step into some of those uncomfortable and difficult conversations, because I think there is a possibility of extending a peace witness into the active attempts of gun culture to draw people further and further into the polarization. Like, you know, I'm fond of saying the devil be crafty like that. Like, how do we help people not yield to the temptation, the very seductive temptation to believe that guns help us be a safer, you know, create safer communities? And so like that's a thought that never occurred to me, right? Like, oh, instead of marginalizing Mennonite gun owners, what does it look like to draw them more deeply into these conversations and equip and empower them to help people who are vulnerable to being polarized and drawn more deeply into the destructive parts of our gun culture? To offer them a different way of thinking about their gun ownership.
I mean, I think it's a great point. And I think that there are conversations that we're going to need to have, especially as churches are even grappling with how do they protect themselves. There are some who would there are people sitting in the pew with guns because of that very thought of, we need to protect ourselves, and this is the only way we know how to do it. It would be a fascinating conversation, I think, to how do we do that in ways that you've talked about, that both of you have talked about, again, getting at that integrity and justice and wellness, and what does that mean, and what does safety mean, and yeah, what does that preparation look like for us? I think that would be an awesome conversation to have, and I think ones that we need to continue to provide ways for that to happen, because I think it's there. I think we're there where we need to be having those conversations together. So I want to just offer a thanks to both of you. It's been engaging. It's been uplifting. It's been difficult to we don't know, we grapple with it, but it's been really wonderful to be with both of you. And I so appreciate what you brought to the conversation. And I'm sure if people have questions, we will give them your emails, or they'll find you and they can ask questions if there is follow-up. I also just want to let people know that we are planning a second webinar in the Ending Gun Violence series. It's going to be held on November 6th at 7 p.m. And there will be there's additional information on our Learn, Pray, Join website on MCUSA. I think Cami also put that in the chat. So there'll be information about it there. And we have resources there available if people want to take a look at that as well. But I just want to wish you all well. Thank you all for joining us. And particularly thank you, Melinda and Andrew, for being with us this evening. Best wishes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks.